In Los Angeles, where luxury cars glided down sunlit boulevards and palm trees lined the avenues, Isabella Morgan lived a life most people could only dream of. At just 18, she was the daughter of Charles Morgan, a billionaire hotel tycoon known for his empire of glass towers that touched the clouds. Despite the glamour, the parties, and the privilege, Isabella carried a quiet burden that wealth couldn't erase. She was confined to a wheelchair after a childhood accident had forever changed her path. While her friends traveled the world or danced under the stars, she often sat watching life pass her by, yearning for a freedom she couldn't fully reach. On that particular afternoon, the city was alive with its usual buzz. Celebrities stepped out of boutiques, tourists snapped selfies under neon signs, and music drifted from cafes. Isabella had gone to a luxury cafe with her father, partly for fresh air and partly to escape the gilded walls of her home. Dressed in a soft summer dress, her hair tied neatly, she appeared as graceful as ever. Yet when her wheelchair jolted to a sudden stop just outside the cafe's entrance, her heart sank. The front wheel had jammed, refusing to turn. People glanced her way, some with pity, others with curiosity, but none stopped to help. Frustration welled inside her as she tried to move forward, the chair rattling uselessly against the pavement. She felt the sting of embarrassment burn her cheeks. Here she was, daughter of one of the richest men in the state, yet completely helpless because a simple chair betrayed her. A small laugh escaped her lips, though it carried no joy, only irony. With a mix of sarcasm and frustration, she blurted out to the young man who happened to pause nearby, "If you can fix this chair, I'll marry you." It wasn't meant as a serious proposal, more like a defense mechanism to mask her humiliation. The young man stopped in his tracks. Ethan Reyes was 22, a hard-working mechanic from a modest neighborhood not far from downtown Los Angeles. His hands bore the marks of labor, grease stains, tiny cuts, the proof of hours spent under cars and machinery. He wasn't dressed in a suit like the men who often surrounded Isabella, but in simple jeans and a work shirt. Still, there was something steady in his gaze, a quiet confidence that made him different, unlike the others who only glanced at Isabella. Before walking away, Ethan didn't hesitate. He gave a small, genuine smile, then crouched down beside her chair without a word. Isabella blinked, surprised by his reaction. Most people either ignored her or drowned her in pity. This stranger, however, acted as though her challenge was serious, as if fixing her chair was the most natural thing in the world. For a moment she wanted to protest, to tell him she hadn't meant it, but something about his sincerity silenced her. Her father, Charles Morgan, sat just a few feet away in his glossy black Rolls-Royce, watching the entire exchange unfold. From behind the tinted glass, his sharp eyes studied the mechanic closely. He had heard his daughter's reckless words and was curious to see how this ordinary young man would handle them. Ethan gently touched the wheelchair's wheels, examining the jammed front caster. He tilted the chair slightly, testing its weight, then pulled a small toolkit from the worn backpack slung over his shoulder. Isabella stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and curiosity flickering in her eyes. "You're actually going to try?" she asked softly, her voice carrying equal parts embarrassment and intrigue. Ethan chuckled lightly. "You challenged me, didn't you? A mechanic never walks away from something broken." His tone was casual, but his hands moved with careful precision as he began loosening a stubborn bolt. People walking past slowed down, some even stopping briefly to watch. The sight of a billionaire's daughter in a broken wheelchair and a grease-stained mechanic kneeling beside her created an unusual picture against the backdrop of Beverly Hills luxury. Isabella's pulse quickened. She wasn't used to being seen like this, vulnerable and dependent in public, yet there was something oddly comforting about Ethan's presence. He wasn't looking at her with pity or judgment, only focus. She leaned back slightly, watching his concentration, the sunlight catching on his dark hair as he worked. Inside the Rolls-Royce, Charles folded his hands, his usually stern expression softening ever so slightly. For years, he had thrown money at problems, buying his daughter. The latest technology, the best doctors, the finest caregivers. Yet here was a young man with nothing more than a backpack and determination, stepping in where others failed. Charles wasn't ready to admit it, but he felt something stir inside him, something close to respect. As the minutes ticked by, Isabella felt her embarrassment fade into curiosity. She studied the stranger working tirelessly on her chair. His movements were steady, his grip sure, and his brow furrowed in quiet concentration. He looked nothing like the polished men she was used to, yet she found herself drawn to his authenticity. She thought about her careless words. "Marry you," and felt a blush rise to her cheeks. She hadn't expected anyone to take them seriously, least of all a stranger. But now, watching him, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, fate had pushed their paths together for a reason. A small crowd had started to form near the cafe's entrance. Some whispered, recognizing Isabella. Others pulled out their phones, curious about the unusual scene. To Isabella, however, the world had shrunk to just two people, herself and Ethan. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the billionaire's daughter, under scrutiny, but just a girl in need of help. And here was someone who didn't treat her as fragile or untouchable, just someone worth helping. As Ethan adjusted another bolt, he glanced up briefly, catching Isabella's eyes. He smiled again, not the forced kind she often saw at galas and business dinners, but genuine. That simple exchange made Isabella's heart skip. She looked away quickly, trying to steady her thoughts, while her father continued to watch silently. A storm of unspoken emotions behind his composed face. What began as a careless challenge was slowly turning into something far more meaningful than anyone had expected. Ethan pulled his small toolkit from the worn backpack he carried everywhere, the same one that had seen countless late nights in his garage. Kneeling on the pavement, he opened it carefully, selecting tools with the ease of someone who knew machines as if they were an extension of himself. Isabella leaned forward slightly, surprised by the seriousness in his expression. What had started as a sarcastic joke was suddenly turning into something real. He didn't just glance at the wheelchair, he studied it with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for an operation. As his hands moved, Isabella noticed the contrast between them. Her own hands, delicate and manicured, rested uncertainly on her lap, while his bore small scars and the dark stains of oil that no soap could completely erase. Yet those hands worked with gentleness, as if he understood the importance of every turn of the wrench. He loosened the jammed caster wheel, examined the worn bearings, and shook his head slightly. "No wonder it gave up," he muttered softly. Isabella tilted her head, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. The more Ethan worked, the more Isabella's amusement gave way to fascination. She had seen plenty of professionals adjust her chair before technicians sent by her father, companies that designed state-of-the-art models, but they never moved with this kind of care. They treated the chair as an object, a product to service. Ethan, however, seemed to see it as something more, something tied to her very ability to live fully. With a small screwdriver, he removed the damaged bearings and replaced them with smoother ones from his kit. She blinked in surprise. Who carried spare bearings in their backpack? Her father's presence lingered nearby. Charles Morgan stood beside his luxury Rolls-Royce now, one hand resting on the door, his eyes narrowed in quiet observation. This was a man who had spent millions designing specialized wheelchairs, some even imported from Europe, loaded with technology and elegance. Yet none had truly given his daughter the ease she longed for. Watching Ethan kneel on the pavement, sweat glistening at his temple under the Los Angeles sun, Charles felt a confusing mixture of pride, discomfort, and humility stirring in his chest. Isabella shifted slightly in her seat, testing the adjustments Ethan had already made. To her surprise, the wheels moved with less resistance. It wasn't perfect yet, but the difference was noticeable. Her pulse quickened, not because of the chair alone, but because of the realization forming in her mind. This stranger was doing more for her in minutes than her family's wealth had achieved in years. She glanced at his face, the seriousness etched into his features, and for the first time wondered about his life. Did he fix machines all day? Did people underestimate him the way they underestimated her? The sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue across the cafe's outdoor tables where people had stopped to watch. Some whispered, recognizing the billionaire's daughter, while others were simply drawn by the unusual sight. A young mechanic, dressed in nothing remarkable, had become the center of quiet attention, his every movement noticed. Ethan didn't care. His world had narrowed to the bolts and bearings, the alignment of the frame, the subtle balance needed to make the chair truly supportive. He adjusted the seat angle, then looked up at Isabella briefly. "Try leaning back now," he suggested. She obeyed, hesitantly at first. To her surprise, the pressure on her lower back eased instantly. Her breath caught, and a gasp escaped her lips. For years, she had endured a subtle ache from sitting too upright, an ache no doctor's design had managed to solve. Yet here, with a few small adjustments, Ethan had given her relief. She turned her head quickly, afraid to reveal how emotional she felt in front of strangers. But Ethan caught the shimmer in her eyes anyway, and he gave a small, reassuring smile before bending back down to finish the grips. From the corner of her eye, Isabella saw her father shift uncomfortably. Charles had always been the problem solver, the man who could command architects, surgeons, or engineers with the wave of his hand. But standing there, watching his daughter breathe easier, he felt powerless. All his money had brought her comfort, but not this kind of simple human effort. He swallowed hard, realizing he had overlooked something vital. Sometimes the solutions didn't come from wealth, but from people who cared enough to try. His chest tightened as he wiped at the corner of his eye quickly, hoping no one noticed. Ethan finished by wrapping the grips with padded material, smoothing them down so they wouldn't slip. His hands moved confidently, almost rhythmically, like an artist adding finishing touches to a canvas. Isabella couldn't stop staring. Her earlier words, "I'll marry you if you fix it," echoed in her head, no longer sounding as funny as they once had. The idea of marriage was absurd, of course, but something about Ethan's determination touched a place in her heart she hadn't realized was still vulnerable. This wasn't just about a chair anymore. It was about dignity, independence, and the way a stranger had treated her like a person instead of a fragile symbol. At last, Ethan sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He exhaled slowly, then looked up at her with a grin that was both tired and triumphant. "Try it now," he said, simply. Isabella's hands trembled as she reached for the grips. The crowd around them seemed to blur, the murmurs fading into silence. She pushed forward gently. To her astonishment, the chair glided smoothly, almost effortlessly, across the pavement. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned back to him, her eyes wide with wonder. I can't believe this," she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotions swelling inside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was dragging a weight behind her. She felt light, capable, free. Ethan's smile softened. "It just needed a little care," he replied. Quietly, to him it was simple mechanics. To her it was life-changing. And standing nearby, her father finally let the tears he had been holding back glisten in his eyes, no longer able to hide what he felt. The joking promise Isabella had made earlier now hung between them like a delicate thread, charged with unspoken meaning. She looked at Ethan, her chest tightening, realizing her careless words no longer felt like a joke at all. The people around them began to clap softly, moved by what they had witnessed. For Isabella, the world had shifted. For Ethan, it was just another act of kindness, and for Charles, it was the humbling moment he never saw coming. When Ethan finally tightened the last screw and gave the wheel one final spin, he leaned back with a sigh of relief. Isabella took a tentative push forward, her hands pressing against the freshly padded grips. The chair responded instantly, gliding with a smoothness she hadn't felt in years. Her breath caught, and then, unexpectedly, laughter bubbled out of her chest-light, free and unrestrained. For a girl who had felt bound by weight and pain for so long, that laughter was more than joy. It was liberation. People nearby turned to watch, touched by the sight of her radiant smile. Her eyes locked onto Ethan, who was still crouched near the ground, watching her reaction with nervous anticipation. He looked tired, sweat running down his temple, but there was pride in his expression. Isabella wheeled closer, the movement so effortless she almost forgot she was in a chair. "I didn't mean what I said earlier," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "That wasn't fair. But what you just did, you've given me more than anyone ever has." Her eyes glistened as she spoke, and for the first time in years, the gratitude wasn't forced. It was raw, unfiltered, real. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with praise. "I just fixed what was broken," he replied, his tone quiet and modest. But to Isabella it wasn't just mechanics. It was kindness, selflessness, and a willingness to help when everyone else had walked past. She felt a lump rise in her throat, realizing that this stranger had restored not only her wheelchair, but also a piece of her independence. Around them, the golden Los Angeles sun dipped lower, painting the cafe terrace in hues of orange and gold, as though the universe itself was honoring the moment. Charles Morgan, the billionaire hotel magnate, could no longer remain silent. For the entire repair, he had stood in the background, observing with folded arms and a critical eye. But as he watched his daughter roll effortlessly, her laughter echoing across the street, something inside him cracked. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Reaching out a hand toward Ethan, he cleared his throat, though his voice wavered with uncharacteristic emotion. "Young man," he began, "you've given my daughter something priceless. Hope." His words carried a sincerity that silenced the crowd, who instinctively recognized the weight of what they were witnessing. Ethan looked up, momentarily startled by the billionaire's gesture. He hesitated before shaking the older man's hand, his rough, calloused fingers meeting the firm grip of a man accustomed to control. For Charles, that handshake symbolized more than gratitude. It was an acknowledgement that wealth could not buy what this mechanic had just freely given. His eyes misted, and he blinked rapidly, unaccustomed to displaying vulnerability in public. Isabella, watching her father's rare display of humility, felt her heart swell with affection for both men, one who had given her life and one who had just given her freedom. The crowd gathered nearby erupted into soft applause, their faces warmed by the story unfolding before them. Strangers, who had paused mid-step to watch, were now clapping as though they were part of a film's closing scene. Some had tears in their eyes. Others whispered words like beautiful and amazing. In the heart of Los Angeles, a city often defined by glamour and wealth, this moment wasn't about status or riches. It was about humanity, about the way a simple act of compassion could touch lives far beyond the ones directly involved. The air felt charged with something rare, genuine goodness. Isabella wheeled closer to Ethan, her heart racing with emotions she hadn't anticipated. She remembered her playful challenge, spoken in frustration and sarcasm. "If you can fix this chair, I'll marry you." At the time, it had been nothing but a shield against vulnerability, a way to mask embarrassment with humor. But now, with her chair rolling smoothly and her spirit soaring, those words carried a different weight. She looked into his eyes, her cheeks warming, and whispered, "Maybe I can't promise marriage just yet, but I do promise this won't be the last time we meet." Ethan's lips curved into a gentle smile, his gaze steady and kind. "I'd like that," he replied simply. There was no arrogance, no attempt to impress, just honesty. For Isabella, that honesty was worth more than all the empty flattery she had received from people drawn to her father's fortune. She felt something stir inside her, and something that hinted at the beginning of a friendship, or perhaps something more. Whatever it was, it filled her with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. The wheelchair no longer defined her. Instead, this moment did. Charles stood silently beside them, studying the young mechanic who had just reshaped his daughter's world. In his mind, he recalled the countless doctors, engineers, and designers he had hired over the years, each promising solutions, each leaving disappointment in their wake. None had given Isabella this spark. And yet here was a humble mechanic, dressed in worn jeans and a grease-stained shirt, accomplishing what money never could. Charles realized that true power wasn't in the wealth he had amassed, but in the humanity he had sometimes forgotten. That realization humbled him more than any business failure ever had. The cafe terrace slowly returned to its normal rhythm as people drifted away, but those who had witnessed the scene would carry it with them. For Isabella, though, life had shifted permanently. She tested the chair again, rolling in smooth circles, laughing with unrestrained joy. Ethan watched quietly, content to see her happiness. To him it was enough. He wasn't looking for thanks, applause, or promises. Fixing things was what he did. It was who he was. But deep inside, even he couldn't deny that this moment felt different. He had fixed machines before, but never someone's spirit. As the evening light deepened, Charles finally spoke again, his tone softer than Isabella had ever heard. "Ethan," he said, "you've reminded me today that money can buy almost everything, but not the things that truly matter. You've taught me more in an hour than I've learned in years." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. "I just did what anyone should do," he replied modestly. But Isabella knew better. Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have cared. That made Ethan different and, in her eyes, extraordinary. With a final glance toward her father, Isabella wheeled up beside Ethan, her smile glowing in the warm Los Angeles dusk. "This isn't goodbye," she said firmly. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had just discovered a new chapter in her life. Ethan nodded, slipping his tools back into his backpack. But his heart beat faster than usual. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had just crossed paths with someone who would forever remain unforgettable. That day in Los Angeles, a careless challenge had transformed into an unforgettable story. A billionaire learned humility, a daughter rediscovered her freedom, and a young mechanic unknowingly became a hero. And as the city's lights flickered on, the three of them stood together, not divided by wealth or status, but united by something far greater: kindness, hope, and the reminder that humanity itself is priceless.